Book 8, Chapter 9, and then Part 1 of 2. Author's note: please remember that this is a work of fiction. This is not based on any particular world, any particular place, any particular religious teachings. It's just what I thought how things should be, how things could be. And I'm probably very wrong. But that's why this is a work of fiction. It's just wouldn't it be cool if this is how things are? Now on to the chapter. Perrin and young Pear walked slowly back to the deep gulf, taking their time, because the person between them didn't want to see them go. But they would return again tomorrow, because they spent every day there. The three of them stopped before the edge of the vast ravine, where their companion could travel no further. At the beginning of the bridge spanning the gulf, Guide Zenas looked up at them from the book he was writing in. As the last mortal guide, until he turned 72, and his aging mortal body would be changed in the twinkling of an eye to a perfected ageless one, he stood as sentry. On the other side of the bridge was paradise, and no one got there without passing Guide Zenas first. Shem smiled experimentally at the spirit between Perrin and young Pear. Quali Pohili smiled back. Shem grinned and walked over to him. Poe's chin trembled. "I'm sorry, I refused to see it earlier, Shem. I was so willing to believe the lies even when I knew the truth. Please forgive me. I've wasted so much time, was angry for no reason for so long." Shem embraced Poe's spirit as best as his physical body would allow. "It's all right, Poe. I forgave you long ago. I'm so pleased. Do you think you're ready?" "I want to cross next week. I think I'll be ready." Shem looked at young Pear and Perrin. "He'll be ready, Guide," Perrin said confidently. He put his arm around Poe's shoulders and hugged him. Perrin's perfected condition allowed him to touch Poe's spirit better than Shem could. Shem grinned again. "Excellent. It'll be a grand celebration." Poe turned to Perrin and tried to touch the collar of his linen shirt, but his fingers sank through it. "I understand it'll be some time until I'm prepared for the next step to this, but I'm looking forward to it." Shem smiled and held up his hand that had developed more wrinkles in the past few years. "I still have a little while too, Poe." "At least I won't be there anymore." Poe nodded to the dark, cold desert from which they had just walked. He returned to the bridge. In the distance beyond the gulf he could see the other side, and the faraway light just beyond the hillside. He nodded with hope. "That's where I'll be next week. There's nothing I want more than that existence." Young Pear and Perrin grinned at Shem. Guide Zenas sighed happily. That's what we need to hear, Poe. I'll be delighted to let you pass." Poe hugged Perrin, then shook young Pear's hand, although he couldn't quite grasp it. "Be sure to tell her, all right?" he reminded young Pear. "Don't worry," said young Pear. "There's no way I'll forget." "I heard about that," Shem said, "from the great guide. It's remarkable progress, really." Young Pear grinned. "I know. I can hardly wait to tell her." "We need to go now," Perrin said to young Pear. He turned to squeeze Poe's arm. "Until tomorrow?" Poe nodded and took a few reluctant steps back. Perrin raised his eyebrows at Guide Zenas. Shem rubbed his forehead and closed his eyes. "Come on, Shem," Perrin whispered. "You know you're just jealous, but your time is coming, remember that." Shem opened his eyes and smirked. "You remember that, Perrin. Then that will be something to witness." Young Pear rolled his eyes. "Just say it, Uncle Shem. He'll keep teasing you until you do." Shem sighed heavily before he whispered, "On your line." Perrin and young Pear stepped up to the edge of the bridge. Poe chuckled. "Prepare." The two men in white were nearly identical in their stance, except that one glowed. Shem's last word came out as a whisper. "Run." The two men bolted across the bridge, side by side. The man who didn't glow shouted, "You're cheating again, old man. You started early." The man who glowed chuckled. "No cheating allowed here, young pair. Pick it up, boy." Mari pulled the ear of corn off the stalk, tapped it 3 times against her leg, and handed it to the little girl standing next to her. The girl with the blonde braids put it in the basket. Jatesy, on her knees harvesting tomatoes, looked up at her dazzling young mother dressed in white and snorted. Mari pulled off another ear, tapped it again, and handed it to the little girl. She didn't take it. "Rose, Rose," Mari sang. "Over here, sweetie. The corn." "What?" said the 3.5-year-old. "Oh, sorry, I was talking." She took the ear from Mari. Jatesy sat back on her heels and watched her mother as she stepped to another stalk of corn. "You were talking, huh?" Mari said. "Pull, tap, tap, tap." Jatesy rolled her eyes. "Yes," Rose said, "to a butterfly." "Ah," Mari smiled. "And what did the butterfly have to say?" "The big flowers down the road are blooming again. She's going to tell her friends." Rose took the corn and put it in the basket. Mari pulled off another and tapped it against her leg. Jatesy pushed back a lock of graying hair and started to laugh. "You're doing it again, Mother." "Doing what, Jates?" Jatesy stood up and mimicked her mother. Pull, tap, tap, tap. Mari bit her lip. "I was? Old habits die hard, even after you've died." "Aren't you supposed to be perfect?" Jatesy teased. Mari gave her a teasing glare back. "My body may be perfect," she said, standing taller, and when she did she was really quite tall. "But my mind and soul have a long way to go yet." Jatesy giggled. "That's for sure, Mrs. Tap, Tap, Tap." Rose wrinkled her nose. "Why do you do that anyway?" she asked Mari. "Because years ago we had to," Jatesy explained. Mari nodded. "To knock the bugs out." Rose pulled a face. "But that's not nice. The bugs get to eat too." "That's true, Rose," Mari admitted. "But it used to be different. The bugs didn't eat their corn. They ate ours. And sometimes they would invade in such great numbers, we'd have almost nothing left of our crops." Rose's mouth dropped open. "But that's not nice. Why didn't you ask them to stop?" Jatesy giggled. "We couldn't. Not back in that world. The bugs wouldn't listen to us. Neither would the deer and the raccoons. They could eat an entire garden that wasn't theirs in one night." Rose's eyes grew big. "That's really not nice." Now Mari giggled. "They just didn't understand us, like we didn't understand them. Rose, I never had a conversation with a passing butterfly in the world." Rose's face fell. "Well, that's sad. What about the birds?" Jatesy and Mari shook their heads. "Only sometimes could we talk to the dogs, cats, and horses," Mari said. "And most of the time the cats ignored us," Jatesy added. "But that's so sad," Rose said. Jatesy smiled sympathetically. "And realizing a family of bears was bedding down in your back garden for the night, or that a mountain lion was spending the afternoon napping on your front porch, those were never good things either." "Why not?" asked Rose, who was fond of cuddling up to anything large and furry. They were fond of her, too. Jatesy pursed her lips. "I think we'll explain that to you when you're a little older. But you don't need to worry about that because that's not the kind of world you live in. Isn't that nice?" Rose nodded happily. "I love the animals, and I also love being in gardens." "Well, guess what?" Jatesy leaned over. "Mugga used to hate gardens." Rose's mouth dropped open. "Mugga, why?" Mari smiled. "I hated the sun, the heat, the dirt, and especially the weeds. There was nothing worse than kneeling in the dirt pulling weeds." Rose scrunched up her face again. "Weeds?" Mari sighed. Oh, Jatesy, the existence this child has. Yes, Rose, weeds were plants we didn't want in the garden. How'd they get there? Lots of ways. Sometimes their seeds were already there, or they blew in with the wind, or birds dropped them. And we couldn't let them stay, because they'd take over the garden and destroy it. Rose was astonished. Jatesy smiled at her expression. They always seemed to grow faster than the seeds we planted. If we didn't pull them out, they'd suffocate the plants we needed to grow. Some were vines that twisted around the plants. Others had big leaves that kept the light off the leaves. And some even had nasty thorns that could hurt you. What are thorns? Rose asked. Jatesy looked over to her mother for an explanation. Carefully, Mari said, Rose, thorns were on lots of plants, sharp little pokey parts that could stab you if you grabbed them wrong. That's bad. Rose shrank back. Mari knelt beside her. Not entirely. Back in that world, we had roses just as we do here. They smelled sweet and came in lots of colors, but their stems were filled with sharp thorns. We just learned to look past the thorns and focus on the beautiful flower at the end of them. Roses like me? Mari tickled her. Exactly like you. Something caught Jatesy's attention, and she looked down the adjacent road, smoothly paved and coated in gold. Mother, I think I hear something. Mari raised her eyebrows at Rose. I hear it too. Rose jumped up and down. A race! Come on. Mari took Rose by the hand and led her to the road. Mari assumed the position standing in the middle of it, with her arms outstretched. On the side, Rose clapped her hands, waiting. There is no way, a voice called from down the road, that this is fair, old man. Perrin, grinning, rounded the curve to the straightaway where his wife stood waiting. He jogged easily, without even a hair out of place, as his grandson, panting heavily and sweating profusely, tried vainly to catch him. Perrin coasted past his wife, slapping her hand as he finished. He even had time to kiss Rose on the forehead before turning around to watch his grandson puff in behind. Young Per wearily slapped his grandmother's other hand and fell on the ground in exhaustion. Jatesy came through the corn stalks with a tall glass of water. She chuckled as she handed it to young Per. When are you going to learn? He sat up. Thanks, Aunt Jatesy. One of these days, mark my words, one of these days I will tie him. He gulped down the water. Jatesy shook her head sadly. In about 49 more years, young Per. Perrin nodded. That's right. And until then, I'm keeping him in shape. He ruffled young Per's hair. He can never catch perfection, but he's becoming exceptional as he tries. He'll still be running the miles from the dark deserts when he's a great-grandfather. I can hardly wait, young Per chuckled ruefully as he rested his head on his knees to catch his breath. Race me! Race me! Rose jumped up and down. Young Per looked up. Are you serious, Rose? I never beat you. You're almost as quick as Pugga. I know! Race me! Young Per smiled and finished his water. He gave the glass back to Jatesy and struggled to his feet. All right, Rose. Take it easy on me, all right? You can carry the corn. What? Young Per exclaimed. Now I have to carry the corn, too? Mari chuckled. I'll get it, young Per. You just race Rose. Rose stepped up to an imaginary line. On your line, Mari announced. Young Per joined Rose. Prepare. They both crouched. Perrin reached over and slipped a finger into the waistband of young Per's trousers. Run! Mari cried. Rose took off running, but young Per lost his footing as his grandfather held him back. Now that is cheating, Pugga. Rose looked back and giggled as Perrin let young Per go. He ran with great drama after her. "Oh, no, she's beating me again. Look at her go!" Rose squealed in delight as she ran down the road and turned left to a house with a short white fence around the front garden. Her mother came out of her front door and grinned. "Run, Rose, run!" "I'm winning, Mama. Do you see? I'm winning again." She rushed up to the gate and slapped it. Her mother stepped out of the gate to see young Pear limping to the yard. "She's just too fast, Versa. I don't know what you're feeding her," he panted with great theatrics. "But she's going to beat Pugga next year. I know it." He collapsed on the bench in front of the fence. "Mind if I take a nap here until dinner time?" Versa giggled. "Well, that's what it's here for." Young Pear flopped on the bench and covered his eyes with his arm. "So, what were you doing outside?" "Oh, you know," Versa said casually. "I was waiting for the best husband the world could offer me, but then I heard a race coming and decided to watch that instead." "Oh," young Pear said quietly. He sat up and took a more formal position. "So, do you mind if I just sit here until that best husband comes home?" Rose sighed loudly. "Oh, Papa, you're so silly." Versa smiled and sat next to him, allowing him to put his sweaty arm around her. "You are silly, you know that," she said, kissing him. Young Pear grinned and rested his head against hers as they watched their daughter run back to Mari and Perrin, who were walking arm in arm up to the house. "So how did it go today?" Versa asked. "Very well. More than well, actually. Poe's ready to come out next week." Versa turned to him. "Young Pear, that's wonderful!" He faced Jim today, and you could see the difference in his eyes. Versa sighed and leaned back against her husband. "I knew the two of you could reach him. You've already had so much success, especially with former soldiers, and now—" "Versa," he interrupted gently, "there's something more." She sat up and looked at him. "What is it?" Young Pear took her hands in his. "Versa, he opened it." She stopped breathing. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "Poe went to see him this morning like he does every day. Of course, he didn't acknowledge him. He doesn't see anyone yet. But this morning, your letter was finally opened and sitting in front of him on the sand." Versa's hands covered her mouth. She glanced over at Perrin, who was nearing. He smiled to confirm young Pear's news. "It took only 6 months. Do we know if he read it?" she asked breathlessly. Young Pear shrugged. "But Versa, it was still open in front of him. Shem spoke to the great guide about it. He says it's remarkable progress. Cain, Nico, Amory, Lannard, and the others are still screaming in the pit with their eyes closed. But he opened his eyes, then crawled up, and accepted Guide Hiram's outstretched hand to get out of the pit. It really is amazing." With tears bubbling in her eyes, she asked, "So he may not need the full 1,000 years?" Young Pear shrugged again. "Remember, there are still many, many steps he needs to take. Crimes he has to pay for if he wants to leave. Victims who need to forgive him. But—" He offered her a small smile when he saw the hope still shining in her eyes. "The Creator has softened so many hearts here. Many have a greater capacity to forgive. You're right again. He'll probably make it out much sooner." She jumped to her feet. "I need to read it again. The copy I made of it, just to remember." Young Pear was already waving goodbye to her. "I knew you would." He smiled as she darted back into the house. "Hey!" Perrin called after her as she jumped up the steps. "Where is he?" Versa turned around on the porch. "Sleeping, finally, so don't get any ideas, Pugga. But I promise, when we have dinner tonight at Lilla and Peto's, the little spewer is all yours." Perrin rubbed his hands together. "Good. I have an experiment today." In the house, Versa rushed to her and young Pear's bedroom and opened the cabinet. She pulled out the copy of the letter she had written and sat down on the bed to read it again, trying to imagine what he might have thought and felt as he saw her words. To my father, Lemuel Thorne, from his daughter, Versa. I'm writing this letter to you in the hope that someday you will want to read it. I want you to know that I think about you every day, as I did when I was a child, and I also hope for you every day. I also want you to know that you have a granddaughter. Her name is Rose, and was born just 2 days before the last day. She was with me at the temple ruin, and she looked upon your face. She's very sweet, unlike me, and is one of the greatest joys in my life. Father, you also have a new son-in-law who loves me more than I deserve. You already know him, and I think you will be pleased to learn that young Perrin Shin is now truly your son. He helped me birth Rose and has claimed her as his own. Rose adores him with all her heart, just as he adores her. There is something more. Father, you have a grandson. Yes, an actual grandson. Young Per and I have chosen to call him Lemuel Shin, in hope of you. It's our desire that someday you will be able to meet him. Grandmother Ursula was able to leave the dark desert and join us shortly after he was born. She said he reminded her of you, except for his eyes. He already has his father's and great-grandfather's dark brown eyes. Father, my husband and grandfather go to the dark deserts every day to work with those who are tired of fighting and want to come home. They come to you each week, but you have yet to see them. They left this letter in front of you. They will continue to visit you until you are ready to see them. Perrin wants nothing more than to bring you home. And when you are finally ready to leave, no matter when that may be, I will be waiting to walk with you across the gulf to bring you home with Perrin. I love you, Father, as I always have. Your daughter, Ursula Thorne Shin. Versa sat on her bed retracing the words, wondering how far he may have read. A noise in the bedroom next door caught her attention. "No, no, no," she heard an urgent low voice. "You're not supposed to get up yet. But since you're stirring, come here, Lemuel. That's my boy. Guess what? We're going to try something new at dinner. Yes, we are." She heard her son giggle, as his great-grandfather probably tickled him. Versa walked quietly down the hall. She peeked into her son's bedroom to see Perrin sitting on the soft chair, bouncing his great-grandson. "Tonight will be the great spew test. Now your grandpa Pato could spit anything green all the way past the table. But my mother said I was even worse than him. So tonight is the test. Can little Lemuel spew further than either of us? You're 9 moons old now, so you should be ready. And to test it, your great-aunt Jatesy gave me some green beans. Now, what makes this interesting is that your other grandfather loved green beans, so you might too. And he liked them raw. I never understood that. When he was your father's age, he'd walk by a farm on the way to the fort, grab a handful from the vines growing along the fence, and eat them all the way to the fort." "Really?" Versa interrupted. Perrin looked up, momentarily startled that he was discovered having snatched yet another baby from his crib. "Yes, really. I thought Jatesy was the only person who did that, but I saw him do it a few times too. He also liked them cooked, without any butter or pepper to hide the flavor." "Strange," Perrin said with a concerned expression and a playful wink. "I like raw green beans too." "He'll be happy to hear that someday, I'm sure." Versa sat next to him as Lemuel snuggled into his pugga. "Thank you for going to see him. The Creator certainly knew what he was doing when he paired you and young Per together. I still find it amazing you want to see him after everything." Perrin shook his head. "When I see him, I feel only sorrow for what he's experiencing. And to be honest, I feel much of his agony is my fault." Versa wrinkled her nose. "Your fault?" Perrin sighed. "I could have done more, you know that. After that first year, when he came back from Idumea, before the attack on Moreland, He really was trying to be different. He was making an effort to be conciliatory. But all I saw when I looked at him was Cain and everything else I detested. I failed to see just Lemuel. I had taken dozens of soldiers under my wing, trained them up properly, gave them what they were lacking. Like you did with Pohili, Versa said. But I didn't with your father. Versa, I was afraid of him. I never would have admitted that in the world. Colonel Parrington wasn't afraid of anyone, but I was afraid of Lemuel Thorne, of what he could do to me, of what he meant to me, of who he may have been. Things might have been different if I had just seen him, accepted him. He looked to me for guidance, I knew it, but I kept pushing him away, ignoring the opportunities until it was too late. For that, I am deeply sorry. For him, for you, for our families, for the whole world. I could have made a difference in the world just by making a difference with Lemuel. Versa slipped her arm into his and leaned against his shoulder. Little Lemuel was sucking on his thumb and slowly closing his eyes again, resting against Perrin, who he occasionally mistook as his own father. Pugga, you're taking far too much blame, Versa told him. I don't know that even you could have undone all the damage Cain did to him. You had my father for a few brief years. Cain had been molding him for 22 years before that. You can't dwell on what should have been. Perrin kissed her on the top of her head. You deliver that line so convincingly, Versa. I've been practicing it. But it's true, and you know it as well as I do. Versa, years ago your father gave Jatesy a kitten as a thank you, or rather as a way to get her feeling maternal and thinking of him or something. Perrin smiled faintly. The moment I saw that tiny thing, I wanted to destroy it. I've always hated cats. That Cain described garters as cats did not help much either. I saw all kinds of implications in that tiny gift. But my family begged me to let the kitten stay, at least for the night. Then it stayed for the next day, and the next, and I began to notice something. I really didn't understand cats. I had a hatred of them because when I was younger, someone told me cats were bad. That's all it took for me to form a lifelong intolerance. But as I watched the cat, as he came to me, purred for me, I began to realize I actually liked him. I had formed a prejudice against cats without ever giving them a chance to prove themselves. I did the same thing with Lemuel. He was a cat. I hated cats. Therefore, he sighed. I wept when the cat died. Only Mari knows that. He was 14 years old and had become my friend. I confided in him all kinds of things, and in return, he brought me dead mice, which he dropped on my desk. Great relationship, he chuckled. We had dozens of his descendants living all around us, for which I was grateful, but none of them were quite like the cat. I had truly learned to love him, just as I've learned to truly love Lemuel. He smiled at Versa. So, I can't dwell on the past, just fix the future. You're right. You know, young Pear said he's always saying that to you, and now you've got me saying it too. Versa laughed. Perrin's smile faded. I want to make it up to him, Versa. I'll continue to see him every week until he's ready to acknowledge my presence. And then I'll see him every day until he's ready to leave. What may have taken me just a few years to accomplish in the world when he was younger will likely take me hundreds of years here. But I will never quit on him. There's no greater work that I should be doing. I've told young Pear this, Versa said, but Pugga, I want to go with you on occasion. Maybe he'll hear my voice. Maybe if he hears from me that I forgive him and still love him, perhaps he'll realize that others can forgive him too. Perrin kissed her head again. You're amazing, you know that? It's paradise, Pugga, Versa exclaimed. Tends to rub off on you, you know. The Creator takes all pain away. All that we suffer is what we're too prideful to release." "You're absolutely right," Perrin said. "There you go, making me say it again." Versa smiled back. "You Shin men are just so easy to train." "I think Mari might disagree with you." Versa laughed with him. After a moment, Perrin sobered again. "But Versa, you're right. Those in the pit screaming are those who still refuse to acknowledge they caused all their suffering. But he's already doing that, Versa. Lemuel couldn't have crawled out of that pit without first feeling remorse, and he had to feel some measure of humility and meekness in order to accept Hiram's hand to pull him out the rest of the way. I'm sure one of his first regrets was you. He loved you once, and it will be because of your efforts that he will eventually take the hand of Shem to cross the gulf and come home to us." "And your efforts and young Pear's, but thank you, Pugga." "Anything for my granddaughter." Mari stood at the bedroom door. "I'm sorry about the baby, Versa, but Perrin insisted he heard him waking up." Versa nodded. "He was, so Pugga's not in trouble. He never is he?" Mari chuckled at that. "Haven't you listened to any of the stories I've told you about him? By the way, the basket from Jates's is on your kitchen table, and Rose is still outside attempting to put her sleeping papa in the wagon to bring him into the house. So far she's managed to get a hand and a leg in." Perrin stood up and handed little Lemuel to Versa. "I think we can help her with the rest of him, can't we?" He kissed Versa on the forehead, then kissed Lemuel. "We'll see you tonight at dinner at Pato and Lilla's, right? You get young Perrin the wagon and we'll pull him over." Mari came over, kissed her great-grandson, and smoothed his blonde hair. "Versa," she said softly, "I'm very happy to hear about your father. If ever you think it might be helpful for me to go see him, just let me know." "Thank you, Mugga," Versa smiled. "But to face you? That may still be a few years, decades." "Centuries," Mari suggested. "I will still be ready." Back outside, Perrin and Mari saw that Rose had already managed to get her father, likely with his help, into her little wagon and was pulling it slowly but proudly up to the house. "See you at Grandma Lilla's house," she called in a very grown-up voice. Young Pear opened his eyes, winked at his grandparents, and went back to sleep. Arm in arm, Perrin and Mari ambled between the flawlessly laid-out flower beds that lined the gleaming golden path. Nearby were the houses of their children and grandchildren. In many ways it was just like it was in Salem. But in many other ways it was far grander, more extensive, and exquisitely more beautiful. When nature cooperated and the inhabitants, both mortal and immortal, respected its power, the effects were breathtaking. Paradise was flushed in vibrant hues, where plantings grew in grand abundance and reverberated with a harmony that defied description. So often when she was still in the world, Mari had tried to imagine what this life could be like, but her mind was too small to comprehend it. She realized now that if she could have imagined it, she never could have continued in her life on the world. Even at its best and most peaceful, life in Salem would have seemed desperate in comparison. Mari chuckled as Perrin joyfully sucked in his breath as a herd of zebras trotted across the path in front of them toward a grassy field. Several of the herd acknowledged Perrin, and, grinning, he nodded back. They would be bedding down in the Shin's front garden later that evening. In the far distance was the city that radiated its own light. Leading up to it were gently rolling hills, dotted with gardens of carefully aligned produce, and without a weed as far as the eye could see. Fruit trees, berry bushes, and grapevines grew on their own, in intricate patterns that from a distance created a colorful tapestry along the hillsides as they weaved in and out and around each other. Sometimes the great-grandchildren liked to run between the vines and shrubs in the natural mazes that also held surprises in the forms of other creatures also enjoying the abundance. Mari smiled to herself, remembering her astonishment as one of her great-granddaughters, Lori and Sam's Maggie, came to her through an organized tangle of sweet pea blossoms. She was riding on the back of a tiger, who smoothly deposited the little girl at Mari's feet. Between the orchards and vineyards and gardens were vast grasses of all kinds, where a variety of animals and creatures fed and rested. Every animal Perrin and Mari had ever dreamed about from Terep's writings roamed freely and gently through the lands. They had fascinating histories as well. Perrin and Mari knew because they frequently found Terep sitting among them, learning their stories, which he shared with the Shins on a regular basis. Just yesterday, they saw him in deep conversation with a silverback gorilla. The gorilla was thoughtfully stroking his chin as Terep asked him questions. Terep would tell the Shins the answers tomorrow when he stopped by for his weekly midday meal with them. The Shins knew the histories of their pets, too. The cat, their dog Barker, and Clark, who had families of their own, frequently came by for a visit and a chat. At first, that startled Mari and Perrin, but soon talking with animals became commonplace, and it seemed tragic that they couldn't do it during their lives. They did it before their lives, after all. They just picked it up again in paradise. Hearing Barker's experiences as Shem's spy during his early years in Edge gave them new and surprising perspectives, for which Shem repeatedly apologized. Clark, of course, shared amazing tales of how he experienced all of Perrin's adventures and provided his recommendations on how horses could have been better trained in the world. The cat, however, never said much when he dropped by, usually with some kittens in tow to show off, but would settle in for an extended scratch behind the ears while Perrin chatted. Occasionally, for old time's sake, he would bring Perrin a mouse, alive and protesting to escape, and snickered as he trotted away. Bordering every grassland, pasture, and garden were flowers of every shape, color, and variety imagined and unimagined. Their fragrances mingled in the air, giving every spot in paradise a unique and intriguing scent. Mari gazed ahead at the distant city, which sparkled like gold. To call it a city was insufficient. Idemia was nothing like it. It was filled with glorious structures of magnificent architecture, waterfalls and statues, trees and flowers and designs and creations beyond the ability and imagination of mortals. As a newly immortal, Mari still found herself astonished and amazed. It wasn't until the last day was over that the last of the veil slipped from her mind, and she comprehended and remembered every last detail of her premortal life. She could understand why there was the delay. The last day needed completion first, and that meant securing all the mortals, including the surrendering soldiers and the startled Idumeans. Everyone who chose not to fight was allowed to live the rest of their natural lives in paradise. No one was quite sure how they all got there. They just suddenly were there, in this astonishing place, some place that was no longer their world. Their old planet still existed, but was now empty of life since it was all here, as well as all of their books and paintings and accomplishments. All of it went with them. And in this paradise, the immortals helped the mortals begin a new life and learn of the Creator's ways. There were no swords, but there were plows. No weapons, but all kinds of tools for building and creating. And there were schools for all ages and all levels. The re-education of the Idumeans was a top priority, especially once they realized that the Creator they'd been told about by Lemuel was nothing like the loving being of light. They could glimpse him in the distance, and always they turned away, too overwhelmed at the prospect, for now. And no wonder they were overwhelmed, because Mari was as well, even though she was immortal. Because it wasn't just the Creator she now lived with. he didn't exist alone, nor could he have. He was her father, and if there's a father, there must also be a mother. The moment Mari saw her, she remembered, and collapsed in joy and excitement when she was once again with her nurturer. There had always been two of them, their father and their mother, her papa and mama. The time she got to sit between them and hold their hands and tell them of every last detail of her mortal life was the grandest moment of her entire existence. They asked her so many questions, and wept when she wept, and laughed when she laughed, and hugged her frequently, and welcomed her home with joy, as they did with every child, each of them, as they were ready for it. Mari knew them. Oh, how well she knew them! She was astonished that she could have so easily forgotten those who had raised and loved and taught her for an eternity before sending her off on her test. But they had closed that part of her mind, which recalled her pre-existence for a reason. Had she been aware of them, she would have not been able to bear being away from them. Existence with her papa and mama had been pure and loving and wonderful. Everything the world wasn't. She would have done all in her power to let her life end so she could rush back to them. But that also would have been misery, realizing that all she had planned with her papa and mama before her mortal life, all that she'd wanted to learn and try and accomplish and experience while in the world, would never happen because she gave up too soon. She understood why ignorance had to be part of the test. There was no other way. A list appeared in her hands when she sat down between her beloved parents, just as she predicted to parent it would. A long scroll of what she wanted to try, what goals she hoped to achieve, and what she was willing to do, and even what trials she would allow. She remembered with perfect clarity discussing her very specific test with her parents before her life, even planning it with them. Now she was there to discuss the results and receive her grade. As they squeezed her and whispered, "Well done, our sweet Mari," she knew she'd passed the test. She even remembered that she had a different name before her life in the world, but she, as most others, kept the worldly names they'd been given, at least for the time being. Before Mari and Perrin now, in the distance, was the creator and nurturer city, made for their children there and those who would someday, or year, still return from the dark deserts. There were many neighborhoods of varying glory and readiness, some nearer to the grand city, others further away because their inhabitants weren't yet ready to be so close to their creator and nurturer. But there was constant movement, closer and closer to the grand city, open paths just waiting to welcome back their children who grew more ready every day to go home. The Shins would be in the grand city tomorrow morning to deliver Perrin's report of the previous day's progress in the dark desert. Mari would spend time in the vast library or visiting with her mother and father, who enjoyed living in their mansion in the city, where they helped prepare homes for others still to return. Her mother never once asked why Perrin and Mari chose to live near the desert. It didn't matter where they lived. They could be in each other's homes in an instant. The Shins, along with their children and grandchildren and the Zenas families, had all wanted to live close to the cold, dark desert, where so many who they loved and wept for still existed. It wasn't visible from the grand city unless one chose to be there and cross the great gulf to visit those who were willing to listen. There were many distances and depths there as well. The deepest, darkest place was the pit, where those who caused the greatest destruction and sorrow screamed and wailed and thrashed in fury for years. There were many other planes of existence, up until the desert reached a spot where, in the far distance, a faint light from the grand city could be seen on the horizon. It was there that those like Poe Healy sat reading, studying, learning, and waiting for their probation to be over. Mari would go next week with Perrin and young Per to watch Poe finally pass Guide Zenas, who stood as sentinel, then accompany him on the bridge to cross the gulf to bring him home. Mari, her husband, pulled her out of her thoughts. Poe? She smiled. Yes, I'm thinking about him. Sometimes I still remember him as that little boy in silk sitting on our front doorstep. I hope he won't mind doing it again. I have so many more stories of Chap to share with him now. Perrin grinned. He's looking forward to it. But he won't be ready for silk for a while yet. Nor do we have silk. I don't think he'll be disappointed by that, though. Mari laughed. We'll have to tell your parents to set out another seat at their former army gathering next week. Poe will be a wonderful addition. Grampy Neeks will want to be by his side, I'm sure. He told me that he and Poe were very close in grasses. The only reason Poe had remained in the dark desert for so long was because of his hatred of Shem. He had made up for his crimes long ago by becoming one of the few honest and noble men in the army. But he had struggled to accept that Shem Zenas wasn't the loathsome sergeant deserving of death he had been told to believe. Mari had gone to visit Poe a few times to explain how it had to be her who Thorn killed that evening at the temple, that only her death would have had the effect it did on the soldiers. It had been prophesied over 100 years before. She also tried to help Poe understand that Shem never could have succeeded in writing to Idumea to deliver the message to them about Edge's disaster, that it truly was Poe's calling, and his act in taking that risk to save Edge was the turning point in his life to becoming the excellent man that he was. He believed her, mostly, but it still took him over 3 years in the deserts to understand that his life played out as it had meant to. Had he not been an Edge to help young Perrin Shin, young Per would have died too soon, either by the hand of Lemuel or in the dungeon. Poe had come to accept and be grateful for that understanding. But for the past couple of seasons, his last remaining fury was still firmly aimed at Shem Zenas. Until now, he was ready to live in peace with everyone else, beginning next week. Others had left the dark deserts over the past 3.5 years. Priscilla had been released, greeted joyfully at the bridge by her mother and 2 sisters, just days after the last day. It didn't take much to help her learn what she'd missed, and soon she was ready for paradise and the grand city. Unlike Anoki Kaya, who still remained in the pit, screaming. Others had been working for a long time to be released. From the day Asa Cush died, Ralph Shin the Elder had visited him in the dark deserts, waiting patiently by the pit for his old friend to stop wailing, then encouraging him to climb out so they could talk. Still, after more than 28 years, Cush hadn't been quite ready to join the army of the Creator when the last day came. But a full season later, he too took the walk across the gulf, Ralph Shin by his side, to be with his wife and great-granddaughters. It took longer for his daughter Ursula Cush Thorn to emerge, requesting to see Perrin and Mari, then asking for their forgiveness for her desire for Perrin over the years was a most humbling test for her. But first, Ursula had to make her confessions to Mari, who tried to assuage Ursula's guilt, but eventually realized she needed to just let the poor woman get it all out. I was jealous of you, that you won him over when I couldn't. I'd been with Cain for 10 years when I heard Perrin finally had married, and even though I knew nothing of you, I sent north to Edge every bitter, horrible emotion I could. I never felt it, Mari tried to say, never knew. But Ursula, whose eyes were squeezed tight in an extreme effort to get out all of her words, plowed onward. I told the women I knew that you had tricked Perrin in some way, or that he'd grown desperate, or that he'd gone stupid to settle for a mere edger. Every woman of stature in Idumea had the most vile reports of you, courtesy of me. I didn't know it, though. Then, when you came to Idumea for the dinner, and I saw you sitting so nervously at the table. I almost felt sorry for you, because you had no idea how much poise and power you actually possessed. And then I envied you all the more for it. I realized then that Perrin hadn't been deceived, but had snagged for himself the most perfect companion. So I hated you even more. When I approached him after the dancing, I hoped that maybe my words to Perrin, my touching the old scar I'd given him, might have angered you. But I could see in your eyes you had no idea of our past. I'd been expecting that you knew all about us, and that it ate at you, and that you were jealous of me. But you had no idea. None at all. There's no anger or envy in your expression, and I was almost humiliated for my past thoughts of you. And they were some horrific thoughts, I'm very sorry to say. I'd spend hours fantasizing about how to get Perrin back, going so far as hoping the garters would kill you, that I could somehow implicate my husband. I had no idea, I promise, of his involvement with the garters. But I would have found some way to blame your death on him, then receive the sympathy and praise of Idemia for exposing Cain, then rush to the side of Perrin and comfort him in his grief. I imagined us together again, making a new family together, even going so far as to convincing your son to change his name to Perrin, and being so kind to your daughter that she would have wanted to marry Lemuel to keep us all together. At the time I was convinced Lemuel was Cain, so there wouldn't have been any complications. When Lemuel contracted the pox, I went up to Edge, not to be with him, but to try to see more of how Perrin felt about you, about how I might possibly undermine all that you had together, to find a way to take it for myself. By this point, Ursula was nearly heaving in contrition, and Mari wanted nothing more to embrace her, but knew that would throw the miserable woman off her course. That embrace would come later. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Mari. Can you ever forgive? I already did, a long time ago. It's buried and gone, and we never have to remember any of it again. It was the private conversation between Perrin and Ursula that Mari watched from a distance, however, that was even more difficult. Both of them appeared to be mortified by events that had occurred decades before, but which needed to be resolved before they could continue on in peace. Although they stood facing each other, Ursula shielded her eyes as she spoke, and Perrin rubbed his forehead as he responded. Both of them focused on the dark sand at their feet, scuffing it around and expressing sentiments each wished past circumstances hadn't forced them to confront. Eventually, they shook hands like awkward teenagers, nodded to each other with immense relief, and Perrin jogged lightly away to return to the safety of Mari's side with yet another burden forever shed. Ursula didn't watch him flee, nor did she glance over to Mari. But Mari watched Ursula and noticed something shift in her. When Mari had first met Ursula at the dinner in Idemia, she'd been taken aback by the woman's grace, poise, and, well, majestic demeanor. Mari had felt like a frumpy dog in comparison, but there had also been a coldness to Ursula and something empty in her eyes. But as Ursula walked away that day in the desert, now able to reside somewhere brighter, some of that natural majesty returned to her, and she could hold her head up once again. Mari never asked Perrin what they said to each other. The past had been fixed and set away forever, never needing to be revisited. A week later, Mari smiled welcomingly at Ursula as she crossed the gulf with her parents, and the tentative smile Ursula gave back to her was filled with warmth and gratitude. They could enjoy paradise together. That's the end of part 1 of part 2 of chapter 9. Part 2 is coming next. Thank you.